This is joint work between me, Dave Levin, Ramakrishna Padmanabhan, Christian Dürr, and Max Mühlhäuser. So you probably all heard of IoT botnets in the recent years, and maybe you have heard of one of the two more prominent examples, such as the Mirai botnet, which caused some of the largest DDoS attacks ever, or the Hajime botnet, which was discussed at NDSS in 2019. Those two are just two examples out of more than 15 active IoT malware families to date. And one of the things we're doing is we measure these botnets. And one of the most simple yet difficult questions is, how big are these botnets? So to understand this, I quickly want to show you how we do the measurements in the first place. So there's active measurements where a crawler reaches out to bots on the internet and records the interactions. And then there's passive measurements such as honeypots or network telescopes, where the bots actually attack the honeypot, and once again, we record these interactions. So given such a measurement, we have the data already, and now we can once again ask the question, how big are these botnets? And one way that is commonly done is, well, we have IP addresses in all of these measurements, either passive or active. So why don't we just count them? So in this case, we have 6 bots. The problem with this approach is that IP addresses change. And what happens here is that internet service providers frequently reassign new IP addresses to their customers, making it at best a short-term identifier. And what happens because of that is that in subsequent crawling events, for example, the same bot might always have a new IP address, inflating the number of IP address, where we cannot say anymore that these are 6 bots because it's all from the same bot. So to address this problem, we introduce in our paper CARDCount, a novel counting technique which stands for considering address reassignment durations when counting, and it provides accurate size estimation combined with confidence intervals for its predictions. It's accurate for long measurement durations, and it's also resilient to incomplete measurement data. So consider a following simple scenario of these measurements that we have on the internet, where we have a bot that is continuously active for our measurement period of 1 week, and we record several IP addresses. What could happen is that because of internet outages, the bot going offline and coming back online, we're not seeing it for a period of that time, and then we see it again later. Okay, here. And then another issue is that another bot may also be active in that botnet, obviously, and that is active at a different period of time, so they don't overlap. So the state of the art has 2 issues. The first of the approaches is called bin count, where we once again just count the unique IP addresses throughout 1 week. And in this case, it would be 7, even though there's just 2 bots, so we have a huge overestimation of the botnet size. One way to deal with this is to reduce the window for which we count the IP addresses, but even for smaller windows such as a day, we oftentimes see overestimation by bin count. The second common approach is max count, which counts how many bots are simultaneously active in the botnet throughout the entire measurement period. And this approach has a problem that if 2 botnet measurements are not overlapping for different bots, then it will only see always 1 bot at a time, once again not being able to get the correct estimate and underestimating. There's an improvement of max count called max count IS, which does this for every autonomous system individually and then sums it up. So once again, to compare this, bin count is inaccurate as it overestimates, however, it's somewhat resilient to missing data. Max count is accurate, but only for very short durations of time, and it's not resilient to missing data, whereas CARDCount fulfills all of these 3 parameters and provides confidence intervals on top. So what does this look like in a real scenario? Here we have a measurement of the botnet, of the Mirai botnet from 2018, and we see the predicted size on the y-axis for each of these, and the windows of 1 day throughout a month on the x-axis. And what's interesting here is that bin count has almost twice the number of estimated bots over max count. So what we know based on the way these 2 are designed is that bin count tends to overestimate and max count tends to underestimate. So the truth is somewhere in between. And once again, this problem stems from the fact that IP addresses change. However, the good news is IP addresses change predictably. As one of my co-authors published in the paper, they found out why and how IP addresses are being reassigned, and that it's following predictable patterns. So as an example, this is the distribution of how long IP addresses are assigned at the Deutsche Telekom AG in Germany. And we can see a clear signal at 24 hours where most of the IP addresses are being reassigned for another 24-hour duration, with some being shorter and some longer. So where can we get this kind of information? Rama in his paper showed that the RIPE Atlas dataset can be used to retrieve this information, and the RIPE Atlas dataset is collected from physical probes that are distributed all across the world, as you can see in this image, and they actively ping servers and provide telemetry data and other information. So now that we have that distribution, let's look at the example of observing 7 IP addresses over 1 week, the Deutsche Telekom AG. And what we would think is, okay, we have this huge signal at 24 hours, so it's probably one bot having a new IP every day, and it's just one. But it could also be, at lower probability, 7 bots having IP address durations of more than a week. Or it's something in between where we have short, long durations, and many more 24-hour durations. And these probabilities is exactly what CARDCount computes. So it takes into account the IP addresses that we have observed over the measurement duration and uses the underlying IP duration distribution to compute the most probable number of bots that have generated this many IP addresses. And for our given example, that would be 1.59 bots. So that's really weird, but because it's small numbers, we can get such odd numbers. What does it look like on the Mirai measurement now? So we see that CARDCount actually falls between the 2 other measurements, which are over and underestimates, which is already very promising. Moreover, it provides confidence intervals for its estimates, giving us an indication of how confident we can be in that number. Nevertheless, we lack ground truth for the Mirai botnet, which is why we cannot say that this is really correct, rather than another misestimate of the botnet size. So to alleviate this issue, we came back to the RIPE Atlas dataset, where we have perfect knowledge of the IP address durations and also the activity of the probes based on these precise measurements. And looking at that, once again, we have the predicted size on the y-axis and windows of 1 week on the x-axis throughout the year 2018. And we see that bin count grossly overestimates the size, whereas max count and card count are fairly accurate estimates of the ground truth. What's interesting here is that max count is actually more precise than card count, raising the question of why do we even need card count? The problem here is that this is a perfect scenario where devices are specifically sent to people to always be on. And they are always sending to a server, so we have little data loss. So in that case, max count can actually observe all of them simultaneously, giving us a good estimate. That's not the case for botnets, though. We have identified a set of confounding factors in our paper, out of which I want to discuss 3 today. The first one is bot churn, that is bots coming and leaving the network, and also capturing partial bot activity where our measurement fails for various reasons. I have combined them in this presentation as incomplete data. And lastly, I want to look at the accuracy of these IP address distributions and how they affect CARDCount. Starting off with incomplete data, what we did is we took the original Atlas dataset and we simulated that for any given hour throughout the measurement, we would only see 80% of the probes active. So what happens here is that we can see that max count and max count AS drop in performance, whereas card count remains a fairly accurate predictor of the botnet size. Moreover, if we go to extreme cases where we only see 30% of the botnet at any given hour, max count drops out of the accuracy completely, and card count falls slightly below the ground truth. And the reason for that is, seeing only 30%, we may not see some of the probes at all, and what we have never measured, we cannot count. So that's the reason why we fall below the actual ground. The next confounding factor is we are using these distributions to compute. So what if these distributions are wrong? The other state-of-the-art doesn't use it, so it's only a problem for card count. However, what we found, once again in a simulation on top of Atlas, is that we can take each individual address duration. For example, for Deutsche Telekom, we have this spike at 24 hours, and add another 24 hours on top, or subtract 12 hours for all the ASs in our evaluation. And what we saw is that the confidence intervals of CARDCount would still cover the ground truth in both of these scenarios, showing that it's highly resilient to small errors in the input distributions. And the main takeaway of these confounding factors is that we had a ground truth experiment and we could simulate what we are commonly seeing in the real world and compare it against a ground truth, showing that CARDCount is the most accurate of the three counting approaches under realistic conditions. And all but one of these confounding factors leaded to actually underestimate rather than overestimate the size. So we are fairly confident that it provides actually a lower bound that is more accurate than max count. Coming back to the Mirai botnet, once again, we see that CARDCount improves over the state of the art when we look at 1 day, but you could say bin count isn't that far off, right? However, if we now start at longer durations, which is one of the main goals of CARDCount, such as 7-day windows, we see that the difference between the three counting approaches starts to differ significantly. And moreover, what you can see is that CARDCount sees about 6,000 bots in a week, whereas it at most saw 4,000 bots in any given day, showing that bots are not always active on the same day, and we actually have to look at longer durations to get a real accurate count of how many bots are in the botnet. We repeated this experiment on the Hajime botnet, getting very similar results as we got for the Mirai botnet. So these are two examples of active and passive measure. To conclude, we show that CARDCount is very promising to provide better size estimates. However, we need these input distributions. And to get these input distributions, we have several options. One of them is if each of you signs up for RIPE Atlas, we can get better distributions from that source. And there are also other sources, for example, convincing ISPs to share the distributions with us, or large providers that have a lot of traffic that could get these distributions so we can accurately predict botnets. Our code is available on GitHub and my contact details are on the screen.
How do you determine which bot network bot is actually with any sort of temporal consistency? Because one of the things that we've noticed in some of our collections is that bots actually will be taken over, or devices will be taken over by another instance, and you combine that with, you get multiple bots behind a particular address because of natting or, carrier grade natting or even country level natting and things like that makes this challenging. Did you account for all of that?
So we looked into NAT quite a lot, and CARDCount is definitely applicable to that scenario. One thing that we cannot do with CARDCount, however, is count the number of bots sharing one public IP address. And that needs to be addressed in future work.
Thank you. So I'm Piyush from KU Leuven, Belgium. I just had one question. So since you're relying on RIPE data, and I think there are two types of nodes. So one are the probes and one are the anchors. And I think anchors are the only nodes that have a public IP address. But all of the probes, they can be behind the NAT. I can maybe just, plug in. So does that kind of impact the, distributions that you are taking from them because maybe they are not representative of the public IP addresses, or does that not apply? Thank you.
So the measurements include the public IP addresses of the nodes because it's sent to the server and they can measure that. And we have several filter lists filtering out probes that, for example, had flip-flop IPs, which could be because of multipass TCP or multi-homing of some kind. So we did a lot of filtering to get as accurate data as possible, which is described in the paper.
Hi, Alexander Bolyaka from Boston University. So on this last slide, you hint at the fact that life would be a lot easier if the ISPs would cooperate more. If the ISPs were to cooperate, why would we want them to give the distribution list rather than just providing us with historical data, like which IPs was this user at, or like doing that in some sort of like privacy preserving way, like giving them the data set and letting them do the analysis on their internal data?
It's a very good question. So I think there, to this date, was no incentive to share this data, which is probably why they're not doing it. And if they share the distributions, that's much more privacy preserving for the individuals. So if you tell me that somebody had that IP, then I can track them as well, right? So if this is public knowledge, you can use it for tracking of individuals. Whereas if you just have the distribution, it's a new IP address, but don't know who had that IP address previously. And then giving it to the ISPs, there's so many out there. that I think it's much easier to get these distributions and doing it yourself rather than reaching out to everyone.
Great talk, really interesting. Did you differentiate between the types of IP addresses, like such as v4 and v6, and especially since sometimes ISPs will bind like a /64 or /60 to a user, and just the multitude of IPs that would essentially be there that a botnet could use?
So we focus on v4 only, and the main reason for that is that we don't have any botnet measurements that are in v6. And if anybody ever comes across one, I would be very interested in seeing that data.
Hi, great talk. This is Eric from Wisconsin-Madison. Maybe this is a little bit beyond the scope of the work, but I was curious. So ultimately, the measurement of the botnet size is based on traffic received by network telescopes. Is there a concern about the representativeness of that traffic? So, for instance, the risk of botnets specifically avoiding that network telescope.
So we use the data from Christian Durr. He published at CCS in 2020, I believe. They had a really big telescope, and it should cover most of the ranges that are scanned by Mirai. So we actually know what Mirai scans, so it should be a representative sample in that case, because the blacklists and everything are known. They also found out that much smaller telescopes can already be sufficient to cover most of the data, if that kind of answers your question.
Perfect, thank you.
Maybe I have a simple question. This is effectively you are tracking attackers. Are they violating the attacker's privacy? Do they protest under GDPR to you? Just kidding.
No, it's a very good question. We actually, in another paper, we looked into the GDPR application to botnet tracking in the first place because we're collecting IP addresses. And it's very difficult to get somebody to consent that has been infected by a third party.
Yeah,
so
that's a joke.
Yeah. It's difficult, and based on our legal analysis, it's probably outweighing the risks for the users because ultimately we can inform them that they have been infected, which is probably in their interest.
Yeah, it's a great work because I think the tracking process reminds me of some of the web tracking. Maybe using the behavior is another line to correlate them. Thanks.
So you mentioned web tracking. I think the cool thing about this work, it could be applied to other IP-based measurements as well. And because we're just using statistics and not like fingerprinting a specific person, we just care about the whole, not the individual. So it's kind of privacy preserving in that sense.